feeling absolutely frozen, absolutely terrified by myself, listening to them rats outside and just feeling like 500 yards away was a busy main street, and it was like another world. I used to think, how do people not see this? I don't know. My dad used to come and go. That was quite difficult. I left home at 15 and was living in a squat for a bit. I'd already started drinking and using at that point.
Mum? Mum, where are you? Mum? Are you okay? Mum?
I didn't see the rest of the world, and the rest of the world didn't see me.
It's all a bit of a blur. One day bleeds into the next. I found it very difficult to keep appointments. So dates and times for me are really hard to remember. I guess I tried to detox 5 times. I really need other people telling me I need help.
I went back home when I was 16, and by the time I was 17, I was pregnant with my daughter. I was sort of living transiently between different people. Was with my boyfriend, left him, went back to my mum's. My dad used to come and go. That was quite difficult. I went to live with my dad for a short time when I was 14. That didn't work. And I came back to London, went back to the school I'd been at previously, but then I got expelled from there. I'd already started drinking and using at that point. Left home at 15 and was living in a squat for a bit. Went back home at 16. By the time I was 17, I was pregnant with my daughter. I was sort of staying with friends until we got a bedsit, and I stayed there until my daughter was 9 months old. And then we got a flat. The first flat I'd ever had. And we stayed there until my daughter was 3. I split up with my partner at that point. I mean, I was using a lot of drugs. He didn't use drugs. When he left, I mean, I was already unmanageable, but that was the first time I became homeless.
The first time you became homeless?
The first time I became homeless. I was 21 and had my 3-year-old daughter. I couldn't manage paying the bills, paying the rent, and I got evicted from that flat. They put us in a hostel, which was horrific. Just like one big room and really full of drugs and not nice. I think I only stayed there 2 days. I only stayed there 2 days. I begged my mum to put us up for a bit, which she did for a very short period of time. I'd managed to get myself pregnant again, which was the straw that broke the camel's back with my mum. I ended up going to live in Cambridge with my dad, which is where I had my son.
I was never stable enough to have my own place anyway. On the 2 occasions I've had my own place, I didn't have it for very long because I couldn't manage it. It was actually easier living on the street. Although it was hard work, it was easier because I'm quite chaotic, I suppose. I just kind of settled for it because I didn't really know what else to do. I didn't really manage very well on a day-to-day basis, and living on the street, there isn't any kind of responsibility on my behalf towards society whatsoever. I could just exist. Which was kind of what I was doing. You know, this is my lot. This is what my life is now.
Then we got a 3-bedroom house, which was amazing, but I didn't want to stay there. And so I think I had the house 6 weeks before I swapped it for one in London, because that's where I wanted to be. And I moved back to an area, deliberately, if I'm honest, to an area that was saturated with drugs. Very quickly after I moved in there, I started selling drugs. You know, I was using constantly. There were lots and lots of people in my house. I didn't get evicted from that house. I had problems with the children because of my drug use. My daughter got taken. Her dad got custody. He went to the court and got a court order for the 7 months that I went into treatment. My son went into care. When I went back to that house, I carried on using. But I did manage to get a transfer somewhere else, and I did manage to stay stable. I mean, I was using, but I stayed housed for another 5 years, and then I came to Brighton in 2001.
Being in addiction, for me, was whenever my eyes opened. Didn't matter what time it was, even if it was 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning. I was not going back to sleep. Quite often used to get woken up by the police in the morning, which was a bit of a bugger because they don't mind what time they wake you up. Some of the street services used to come and wake us up, but usually I'd be awake by 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. Hoped it hadn't rained in the night. Roll the sleeping bag away. We used to sleep on cardboard because it used to insulate you from the cold and the concrete. I just kind of wake up in the morning and start begging, really. Or I'd go to the big issue office and get some big issues and sell those, but that's only if I manage to wake up with a few bob in my pocket in the morning. Usually, straight away, I'd have to think about getting money to get heroin. And that usually meant asking people for money sat outside cash machines. Those that are on their way to work. And beg up enough to score a £10 bag of heroin, which could sometimes take all morning. Sometimes could take an hour. And then it would be a case of getting the drug, using the drug, and then going back to do exactly the same thing again. And it would be like that for me all day long. Visit a soup kitchen in the evening to get something to eat. Or a day centre to get something to eat, because my money was for drugs, it was never for food. I never used to look after myself that well. I'd be selling the big issue. I didn't like begging so much. It was just difficult to ask, you know, but if I was desperate enough, I could do it, but I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. And I would, not through any shoplifting or any kind of skullduggery like that. I'd be selling the big issue to get smack or crack, or I'd be begging to get smack or crack. And I would do that all day, every day, through the night till about 9 o'clock, and then I'd go and find somewhere to bed down for the night, somewhere away from the seafront and out of the way of the police. They always managed to find you, the police. Or I'd find a shop doorway or a stairwell, a car park stairwell that was concrete in the least. The shop doorways were good, you could sleep there and no one would bother you. as long as it was out of the town and away from the seafront. My day was mainly making money.
My intention to leave the treatment centre was to use.
I prefer my own company, really. I'm not much of a people person.
Tell us a bit about where and when you were born.
I was born in 1971 to a family of 2 adults and 4 siblings. Secondary school, I left with 7 GCSEs and went on to college to do City and Guilds engineering. Kind of stuck with that trade, really. I'm actually an engineer by trade.
An engineer by trade?
Until my addiction took hold of me, that's what I've always done. I've always worked. I got to the age of 30 and that's when I ended up homeless. Living on the street. Unemployed, claiming benefits. It got to the stage with my family where they kind of washed their hands of me because they could no longer cope with me and my addiction because I'd stolen off them.
Stolen them?
Stolen off them, yeah. Yeah, I was untrustworthy, yeah. They couldn't have me around, actually. It was making their life a misery. You know, because I'm quite a selfish individual. I was only worried about me, I was never worried about them. They just couldn't cope with it.
No.
No. So I was actually out of their lives. I was out of their lives, but they were never out of mine. I'm not sure if that's the right way around or the wrong way around.
Right.
As I mentioned earlier, I actually died in hospital once. I think it was twice. I'd gone over, as they say, you know, taken too much. On top of then there was the, the emphysema and the Hep A and the Hep B and the Hep C and thrombosis in my legs. I'm sure opium gets used, and codeine, and people can take it easily, but with me, I tend to take too much. Yeah. It was when crack cocaine entered my life for the first time. You know, that's when things really started to deteriorate for me. On top of the pneumonia and the state of my lungs.
So, clients come here to detox from heroin and also to detox from diazepam as well, which is a drug that a lot of clients use. But with very few exceptions, most clients are here to detox from heroin. They're here on average between 8 and 12 weeks, and during that time, they're given a substitute for heroin, which is usually methadone or Subutex, 2 different substitute drugs. And they have a gradual reducing of that substitute drug while they're here, so they can be as comfortable as possible while they're coming off the drugs.
Living on the street is sometimes better than living in a hostel.
A few days before the clean day, the actual clean day itself, and 1 or 2 days after the clean day itself, are high-risk times because there's a gradual realization that they're having to let go of the drugs and drink, and it can be a very difficult concept, I think, to accept at that early stage of treatment. Plus, at the point where they're nearly clean or clean, around that period, they're still raw, so they can have thoughts that can be quite irrational, you know, thinking,
Oh, I can go out there and control it now.
these are the things they tell me, like,
I'm thinking I can go out there and just use once a week or something.
or,
I don't need to go through treatment. I know what I need now. I can stay clean. I don't want to go through 6, 9 months of treatment where I've got more boundaries.
so they start telling themselves that they can control their use. They wouldn't come through that door unless they had a really strong wish to be clean. Clients come into treatment with enormous courage and obviously a very strong desire to be clean. But the addiction is so powerful at that early stage that the urge to use, especially when they're walking down St James's Street, they're going to bump into at least 2 or 3 dealers. So that early stage of treatment, if they weren't on escort, they wouldn't be strong enough to resist the urge to use.
I knew I'd be homeless. I didn't really give a damn. Hadn't thought twice about it.
It can be very difficult for them living in a small house. It can get quite intense. They can get quite bored in the afternoons because most of the groups happen in the mornings. But what they're learning to an extent is how to get used to a kind of real time, because, you know, when they're using drugs, time goes either faster or slower than it does in real life. So we don't overstructure the day because they need to get used to a kind of real time.
For me, over the years anyway, homelessness has gone hand in hand with squatting. Being a street alcoholic and a drug addict, especially in winter, spots are really convenient.
Most of the clients will tell you, if you ask them, it's the feelings returning as the drugs come down that they find the most difficult. And a lot of them will say,
I'm frightened of who I'm going to be without drugs. My intention to leave the treatment centre was to use.
most of them have been using drugs since they were 13. Some of them have been using heroin since they were 13, 14, so they haven't had a normal adolescence developmentally. They haven't been through the normal developmental stages, if you like, without drugs.
I knew I'd be homeless. Didn't really give a damn.
So to suddenly have your feelings as you're becoming closer and closer to getting off the drugs can be very, very scary for you.
It felt easy for me to be back on the street.
And they can have a very high level of anxiety, feelings beginning to trickle through that they haven't experienced for many, many years, and the fear of who they will be without drugs.
The first night I got there, I went and met somebody so I could score some drugs, and you know, I laugh at it now, but he said, "Do you want to stay at my place?" And his place was a house made of cardboard. It was a cardboard box, basically, which was hilarious at the time, because he didn't say that before we got there. But in my insanity, that was fine, and we lived in cardboard boxes and sleeping bags. We lived like that for a good few weeks until we got back one day and the bin men had destroyed our house. It wasn't so funny at the time. That went on for about 3 months, till it got to the stage when it was really, really difficult.
I can say that the best education I ever had was sitting with our clients and listening to their experiences, their take on life, their hopes, their aspirations, how we as a society have failed them. One man said to me, "The only skill I ever learnt in the army was how to drink." And he became a homeless alcoholic in Norfolk Square. He woke up one morning next to his best friend Huey, and Huey had died in the night. And he knocked on our door the next day and he said he didn't want to die on the streets. And one thing he told me, probably about the first time I met him, he said, "The worst thing about being homeless is sitting in Norfolk Square at dusk and watching people going home. And you see the light go on and the curtains close. And every one of them told me, I'm out here and I'm not allowed in there." He had a chronic alcohol problem. But he went through rehabilitation services and he lived for another 21 years. And I would see him walking around the streets, whistling. He had a job in the nursery at Stammer, and he just whistled for the rest of his life. He'd found a life in recovery, off the streets, purposefully housed, properly housed, purposeful occupation, involved in nature, and he was one of the happiest people I ever met in my life. An absolute inspiration. And I carry a few people like him around with me in my mind, because when I'm being bogged down by paperwork and bureaucracy, and I think, why the hell am I doing this? I go back to him and I think, oh yeah, that's right. Even if there was just one like him, then it's worth it.
We were coming up to Christmas and it was freezing. And I ended up getting an infection in my leg. There was this organisation, and they knew I was from Brighton. And every single day they used to come up to me and say, "Right, this is killing you, you don't need to live like this." We used to go in there and get food, and one of the workers came in and started talking to me, and they said they wanted to get me off the street. They just took my clothes and threw them in the bin. I was rotten.
The thing I remember most from being on the street is walking around on Christmas morning. Because all the traffic stopped on Christmas morning. Everyone was at home opening their presents.
I was sad most of the time. Unhappy.
And that feeling of desperation. This is my lot.
It was the end of the line for me. I'd had so many tries at recovery, and in my eyes, failed. I was totally hopeless.
I felt lower. Worse than, the lowest of the low.
I managed to stay in a hostel until I was able to walk properly.
All the traffic stopped on Christmas morning. Everyone was at home opening their presents. From being on the street for years, you see people walking about. You see people on their way to work. From 5 a.m. onwards, it's always busy. There's cars and buses. But Christmas morning in Churchill Square, coming out of Churchill Square car park, and it was quiet.
I'd been living in that place of self-pity and anger, hating myself and not wanting to use, but believing that I couldn't stay, stopped.
It was quiet and there was no one about. And that thought that everyone's at home with their families. Everyone's woken up this morning and opening their presents.
It was an absolute fucking nightmare. I could not maintain it. I didn't want to use anymore.
Walking down Churchill Square Road with nowhere to go and no one to be with. But also that thought that everyone's with their families or with someone they've got in their life, someone they love. And me just having just me and nothing else.
I phoned this guy at the homeless team from Brighton. Suicide had become a real thought.
That's what I remember the most, actually. That feeling of having nowhere to go and feeling cold and sad and lonely and afraid.
And then thinking of everybody I've left behind.
I thought about suicide, but the thing that stopped me was I could achieve so much more. The drugs stopped working, but they didn't stop me from feeling. Do you know what I mean? I was going to die. And that feeling I could achieve so much more.
I wanted to be clean and stay clean, more than I wanted anything.
So when they come through the door, we try and give them a really warm welcome.
I was uncomfortable and embarrassed, but I worked through that a day at a time.
We try and say, well done for getting here, really affirm them for getting through the door and give them a sense of you're in the right place.
I started getting really honest.
And you hear stories, and you think, how can anyone survive that? But every one of our clients has a very, very painful story.
I wasn't sure I wanted to go back into treatment again. You know. It was just a bit tricky, but even though I'd had enough, I wanted to use the first 3 months, really.
We have an induction period. Sometimes they're living such chaotic lives that they come in with a big bag of dirty clothes and there are things in there that they don't even know are there.
I was scared of discovering who I really was.
And they come in,
case I didn't like me.
they have a coffee and just try and settle in a bit.
It was the best thing I've ever done.
I remember the staff leaving ceremony, and so the room was packed with about 50 clients, all clean, all been through recovery to say goodbye to this member of staff, and loads of them have brought their children. So there were all these clean clients, all been through our service, and some of them with their kids, and you could see this wonderful rapport with their kids, all looking great. And one of them stood up and he said, look at us, all clean, all been through recovery. Once we were out in the streets using. Imagine us let loose now, using on the streets. But look at us here. We're all clean.
Without my recovery, I wouldn't have my life.
That always stays with me.
I'm in supported housing now. I couldn't admit how much help I needed to learn to live on my own. I couldn't cope. I used. And I've never done stable living. I've been all over the place. And it's about learning how to do it now. Because I don't want to go back to that situation. Waking up in the morning, being absolutely frozen, absolutely terrified, by myself. Just listening to them rats outside and feeling like 500 yards away was a busy main street and it was like another world. I used to think, how do people not see this? I don't know.